I woke from a 3-week coma to find my fiance standing beside the woman he'd always sworn was just his first love, and a room full of people who believed my brain had checked out along with my heartbeat. Julian Beckett stood at my bedside in a suit that cost more than my recovery bill, smiling the specific smile of a man rehearsing gratitude for an audience. Beside him, close enough that their elbows kept accidentally on purpose touching, stood Paige Whitmore, dabbing her eyes with a tissue like she was auditioning for a role she'd already been cast in years ago. "Nora," Julian said, taking my hand like he was claiming luggage at baggage claim. "Thank God, Nora. Can't wait to take you home." I looked at his hand. Then I looked at Paige, standing close enough to be either his emotional support animal or his backup plan. Then I looked past both of them, to the man standing near the window in a suit that cost more than Julian's entire net worth, arms crossed, watching me with the particular stillness of someone who had clearly not slept, showered, or blinked in 3 weeks out of sheer spite toward the universe. I didn't know his name yet. I didn't need to. Something in me, some old animal instinct that had apparently survived the coma intact, decided he was infinitely more interesting than the man currently holding my hand like a receipt. So I pulled my hand free, reached across the bed, and wrapped my fingers around his instead. "Sweetheart," I said, voice sweet enough to rot teeth. "Take me home." The monitors beeped in confusion. Julian's mouth fell open like a garage door with a broken spring. Paige's tissue paused mid-dab, suspended in the air like she'd forgotten what crying was for. And the billionaire stranger I'd just adopted as my fiancé looked down at my hand in his, one eyebrow lifting a single, unbothered millimeter, and said the only sensible thing anyone in that room had said all morning. Of course. The billionaire's name, I learned approximately 4 minutes later from a nurse who apparently gossiped faster than she charted vitals, was Gideon Cross. "CEO of Cross Dynamics," she whispered while checking my phone. "He's been here every day. Didn't leave once during the first week, when they weren't sure you'd wake up at all." "Every day," I repeated, filing that away next to the fact that Julian, my actual fiancé, had apparently visited on a schedule roughly comparable to a dentist appointment. "Mr. Beckett came sometimes," the nurse added, reading my expression with impressive accuracy. Usually with her. Her required no clarification. I'd clocked Paige Whitmore's proximity to my fiancé within the first 90 seconds of consciousness, filed it under problems I apparently already knew about, but my concussion was kind enough to let me forget for one peaceful morning, and moved on. Julian returned to my room that afternoon without Paige, which I assumed was meant to be romantic. "Nora, sweetheart," he said, sitting carefully on the edge of my bed like I might shatter, or worse, remember things. The doctors say memory loss after trauma like this is common. "Do you remember anything? Our engagement? The wedding planning?" I considered my options. Option 1. Tell him the truth, which was that my memory was, annoyingly, entirely intact, including every detail of the last 6 months of watching him orbit Paige Whitmore like she owed him money. Option 2. Lie, badly on purpose, and watch what happened. I have never in my life chosen option 1 when option 2 was available. "I remember some things," I said carefully. "I remember you. I remember a woman with very good posture standing near you a lot." Julian's face did something complicated. "That's Paige. An old friend. She's been very supportive during this difficult time." "How supportive?" I asked, on a scale of standing near my hospital bed to holding your hand while I was technically dying. "She's just a friend, Nora." "Fascinating," I said. "My memory's foggy, but even I know that's not what friends' hands are usually doing." He opened his mouth, closed it, and changed the subject with the smoothness of a man who'd clearly had practice. "The wedding's been postponed, obviously, until you're stronger. My mother's handling the details." "Your mother?" I said.
"Diane."
"Remind me, does she still refer to me as the Callahan asset when she thinks I'm not listening, or has 3 weeks of unconsciousness earned me an upgrade to the Callahan situation?" Julian went very pale. "You remember that?" I did not, in fact, remember that specific phrase, having never actually heard it. I was, however, willing to bet considerable money that it existed somewhere in Diane Beckett's vocabulary, and Julian's face had just confirmed it beautifully. "Memory's a funny thing," I said, settling back against my pillows with the deep satisfaction of a woman who had just gotten free information for the price of one bluff. "Comes and goes." mostly comes when it's inconvenient for other people. Julian left shortly after, mumbling something about updating his mother, and I lay alone in my hospital room for exactly 4 minutes before Gideon Cross appeared in the doorway, holding 2 coffees, looking at me like I'd just done something mildly impressive and deeply concerning at the same time. "You're lying about the memory loss," he said. "Not a question." "I'm recovering creatively," I said. "There's a difference." "There isn't," he said, handing me a coffee anyway. "But I approve of the difference you've invented." I got discharged 4 days later, which meant 4 days of watching Julian and his mother orchestrate what I could only describe as a hostile takeover of my recovery. Julian Beckett arrived on day 2, dressed like she was attending a funeral for someone she hadn't liked much, and greeted me with the warmth of a woman inspecting a slightly bruised piece of produce. "Nora, darling," she said, air kissing somewhere near my ear. "You gave us quite the scare. How are you feeling?" "Confused," I said. "Mostly about why I keep hearing the word asset whenever I'm not fully in the room." Diane's smile flickered, a single frame of genuine panic before her composure reasserted itself. "I'm sure I don't know what you mean." "Must be the concussion," I said pleasantly. "Makes me hear things. Also makes me forget things. It's very selective. Ask me literally anything about the wedding seating chart, though, and I'll draw you a diagram." She left shortly after, citing an urgent call, which I found suspicious given that her phone had not, at any point, actually rung. Gideon visited every day, always in the late afternoon, always with coffee, always sitting in the chair by the window rather than crowding my bedside like he was trying to claim territory. "You don't have to keep coming," I told him on day 3, mostly to see what he'd say. "I know," he said, not looking up from whatever he was reading on his phone. "That's it. I know. No dramatic monologue about duty or destiny. Would you like one?" "God, no," I said. "I've had enough dramatic monologues this week to last a decade." Julian gave me 3 yesterday alone, and one of them was about the catering. Gideon's mouth twitched, the closest thing to a smile I'd gotten out of him in 4 days. "The catering monologue. Was it moving?" "Deeply," I said. I nearly forgot my fake amnesia and cried real tears about shrimp cocktail. He set his phone down. "Why are you actually doing this?" "The Memory Loss Act. You don't strike me as someone who enjoys theater for its own sake." I considered lying, then decided against it mostly because something about his flat, patient attention made lying feel like a waste of good material. Because the truth got me nowhere for the last 6 months. Julian's been slowly drifting toward Paige since spring, and every time I brought it up, I got told I was imagining things, that I was insecure, that a woman with my business background shouldn't be so emotional about a friendship. And now I have a medical excuse to say exactly what I think and blame it on a head injury, I said. It's honestly the most freedom I've had in a year. Gideon studied me for a long moment, something unreadable moving behind his expression. That's either the smartest thing I've heard all week, or genuinely concerning. "Why not both?" I said. "Most good decisions are." He almost smiled again, and I decided, filing it away with the same efficiency I'd filed away Diane's slip about assets, that I liked being the reason for it considerably more than I probably should. I went home from the hospital with Julian, not because I wanted to, but because pretending to have amnesia loses some of its comedic value if you refuse to go home with your own fiance on principle. I regretted it within the hour. Mother's arranged a small welcome home dinner, Julian announced, guiding me into the Beckett family's absurdly large dining room, where Diane sat at the head of the table like a queen presiding over a hostage negotiation. Paige was already seated. Of course she was. "Nora," Paige said, rising to hug me with the enthusiasm of someone who'd rehearsed the hug in a mirror. "I'm so relieved you're all right. I've been thinking about you constantly." "Have you?" I said, settling into the chair Julian pulled out for me, directly across from her. "That's touching. What exactly have you been thinking?" "Just hoping you'd recover quickly," she said, smile faltering slightly. "It's been such a difficult time for everyone." "For everyone," I agreed. "Though I imagine it's been considerably less difficult for whoever got to spend the last 3 weeks having dinner with my fiancé instead of sitting in a hospital bed." Diane's fork paused midair. Julian choked slightly on his water. "Nora," Julian said carefully, "you're still recovering. Maybe we shouldn't." "Recovering, yes," I said. Not recovered enough to have forgotten how math works, apparently, because I keep doing the sum of 3 weeks unconscious plus my fiance's schedule and getting an answer I don't love. I only came to support Julian, Paige said, her voice climbing half an octave into wounded innocence territory. As a friend. A friend, I repeated.
Right.
And the hand holding at my hospital bedside. Also friendship? Julian's face went the particular shade of red that suggested he had, in fact, been caught doing exactly the thing he was hoping I wouldn't remember. I was comforting her, he said. She was upset.
About you.
Naturally, I said. Nothing comforts a worried woman quite like holding hands with someone else's unconscious fiance's fiancé. I'm sure there's a greeting card for that. Diane cleared her throat sharply. Nora, darling, perhaps the head trauma is making you say things you don't mean. Perhaps, I said pleasantly. Or perhaps the head trauma removed whatever filter was previously stopping me from saying them out loud. Truly, a medical mystery. The doctors should study me. I speared a piece of asparagus and chewed it with the calm satisfaction of a woman who had just watched 3 people simultaneously realize they might have miscalculated how much of their behavior an unconscious woman actually absorbs. Dinner continued in strained, brittle politeness, punctuated occasionally by me misremembering small, devastating facts. Julian's allergy to shellfish, conveniently ordered anyway, the name of our wedding venue, deliberately swapped for a competitor's, and my personal favorite, a warm, innocent inquiry about whether Paige had always been part of the family, delivered with just enough sincerity to make Diane visibly age 3 years in real time. By dessert, I'd learned considerably more about my own engagement's structural weaknesses than I had in the previous 6 months combined, and I hadn't even needed real amnesia to do it. Fake amnesia, it turned out, was an extraordinary diagnostic tool. Gideon started sending things after that dinner, which I chose to interpret as either concern or excellent situational awareness, possibly both. The first thing was a phone. A new one, already set up, already loaded with a single contact. In case yours got confiscated for your safety, the note said, in handwriting so precise it looked engraved. It didn't. I checked. But I know how that family operates. The second thing, 2 days later, was a folder delivered by a driver who did not linger long enough for me to ask questions. Inside was a financial summary of Beckett Holdings, the Beckett family's construction and development company, laid out in clean, damning columns. 3 failed real estate ventures in as many years. A credit line stretched thin enough to see daylight through. And at the bottom, a projected timeline showing exactly how long the company could survive without an infusion of capital that, as it happened, my family's manufacturing contracts were uniquely positioned to provide, contingent on a signed marriage that locked in preferential terms for a minimum of 10 years. I read it twice, then called the number saved in my new phone. You knew, I said, when Gideon picked up. I suspected, he said. I had someone confirm it after the accident. Julian's family needs my family's contracts to survive, I said slowly, testing the shape of the sentence in my mouth. This whole engagement was never actually about me. It was about spreadsheets. Welcome to marrying into old money without actually having any, Gideon said, with the particular dryness of a man who'd clearly watched this exact play performed several times before. It's rarely about the bride. That's bleak. It's business, he said. I prefer honesty about it, personally, which is admittedly rare in my line of work. And what is your line of work, exactly? I asked. Because I've gathered CEO, suspiciously well-informed, and possibly has people whose entire job is delivering damning folders. But I feel like there's more. Cross dynamics, he said. Logistics, primarily. Shipping, warehousing, some private security contracts. Private security, I repeated. Very specific thing to mention casually. I mention what's relevant. Is it relevant that you've apparently been keeping tabs on my accident? I asked, my voice sharpening slightly despite myself. Because nobody's actually told me much about what happened. Just car accident, coma, lucky to be alive. Very vague, for something that nearly killed me. There was a pause on the line, longer than I expected, and something in the quality of his silence told me I'd just stepped on something considerably more complicated than a financial spreadsheet. We should talk about that in person, Gideon said finally, his voice carefully even in a way that made my stomach drop several floors at once. Not over the phone.
Gideon.
Tomorrow, he said. I'll explain everything I know. I should have told you sooner. I was waiting until you were stronger. I've been conscious for a week and sarcastic for most of it, I said. I think I can handle it. We'll see, he said, and hung up before I could argue, leaving me alone in my apartment with a damning financial folder, a mysteriously well-informed billionaire, and the growing, uncomfortable suspicion that my accident had been considerably less accidental than everyone kept insisting. Gideon arrived the next afternoon with a laptop, a folder considerably thicker than the last one, and the expression of a man about to deliver news he'd been rehearsing all night. The accident wasn't random, he said, without preamble, once we were seated in my living room. You were leaving the Beckett family's charity gala. Witnesses reported you left upset, alone, walking to your car rather than waiting for a driver. I remember being upset, I said carefully. I don't remember why, exactly. Everything from that night is blurry. According to two guests who spoke to security afterward, Gideon said, you'd just seen Julian and Paige together near the coat check. Close together. The kind of close that doesn't require much interpretation. I sat with that for a moment, the vague, formless dread I'd been carrying since waking up finally crystallizing into something specific and cold. Okay, I said slowly. So I left upset. That explains the leaving. It doesn't explain the car. A man followed you into the parking structure, Gideon said, sliding the laptop toward me, opening a file labeled with a case number instead of a name. Security footage, recovered after some difficulty. He approached you near your car. There was a confrontation. He pushed you toward the street exit. I watched the grainy footage, my own figure stumbling backward, a man's shape closing in, and felt something in my chest go very still and very cold. He didn't hit me, I said. The car did. The car hit you because he pushed you into its path, Gideon said, his voice carefully controlled in a way that suggested considerable effort. I was already at the venue that night. Unrelated reasons. My security team was reviewing footage around the perimeter for something else entirely, and one of them caught the incident live. I got to you before the ambulance did. You saved me, I said slowly. I got lucky with timing, he said, deflecting in a way that told me he'd rehearsed the deflection considerably more than the actual information. The relevant part is the man. We identified him 3 days ago. He's talking, in exchange for a considerably lighter sentence than the alternative. And Gideon's jaw tightened. He was paid. Not to kill you. To frighten you, apparently, make you unstable enough that you'd run back inside crying, straight into whatever comfort Paige was prepared to offer Julian in front of everyone. He says he only meant to grab you. The push was improvised and considerably worse than intended. Paid by whom? I said, though some cold, resigned part of me already suspected the answer before he said it. Paige Whitmore, Gideon said. Wire transfers, 3 separate payments, the last one 4 days before the gala. I laughed, sharp and humorless, the sound surprising even me. So let me get this straight. My almost mistress-in-law paid a man to traumatize me into a breakdown so she could comfort my fiance over my emotional collapse, and instead accidentally put me in a coma for 3 weeks. That's an accurate, if unusually calm, summary, Gideon said. I'm not calm, I said. I'm just extremely good at sarcasm as a coping mechanism. Give it a minute. The screaming's coming. Take your time, Gideon said, and to his credit, he didn't flinch when, exactly 90 seconds later, I did, in fact, start screaming into a couch cushion while he sat patiently beside me, saying absolutely nothing useful, which was, somehow, exactly the right amount of help. I spent one entire day being furious in a very structured, professional way, the kind of fury that involves calling my family's legal team, requesting every document related to the Beckett family's contract terms, and drinking exactly 1 glass of wine at a time, so I could still read financial disclosures with clear eyes. By the following morning, I had a plan, and it involved considerably more spreadsheets than revenge fantasies typically require. You're doing the thing, Gideon observed, arriving with coffee and finding me surrounded by printouts at my kitchen table. What thing? The thing where you decide the appropriate response to attempted vehicular manslaughter is a very organized folder. It's an extremely organized folder, I said. I've color-coded by category of betrayal. Financial motive is blue. Direct emotional cruelty is red. Attempted homicide gets its own tab. Naturally. I considered simply screaming at everyone involved, I said, but I've done that already, in your presence, into a couch cushion, and while cathartic, it lacked long-term structural consequences. I prefer consequences with paperwork. Gideon sat across from me, studying the folder with something that looked, for the first time since I'd met him, like genuine respect rather than careful patience. What's the plan? The Callahan-Beckett contract renewal is scheduled for next month, I said. My family's manufacturing agreement is the only thing keeping Beckett Holdings solvent past this fiscal year. Julian's mother has been counting on my continued cooperation and my continued ignorance. And you intend to provide neither. I intend to attend the renewal meeting, I said, fully recovered, fully informed, and fully prepared to explain to my father, in front of Diane Beckett, exactly why the Callahan family will not be extending preferential terms to a family that hired someone to traumatize me into a car accident. That's not technically what happened, Gideon pointed out. Paige hired the man, not Diane, as far as we know. Paige is planning to marry into that family, I said. Diane has spent months treating me like inventory. I'm not inclined to be generous about degrees of separation right now. Fair, Gideon said. Do you have proof connecting Paige to the payments that would hold up outside a hospital confession? The wire transfers you mentioned, I said. Assuming your very well-informed security team documented them properly.
They did, he said.
I can have the full financial trail ready within 2 days. I studied him for a moment. This man who'd apparently spent 3 weeks sitting in hospital chairs, delivering coffee, and quietly assembling a financial investigation without once asking anything of me in return. Why are you actually helping me? I asked. And don't say, I had someone confirm it again. That's not an answer. That's a deflection wearing a business suit. Gideon was quiet for a long moment, something careful and deliberate crossing his expression, like a man deciding how much truth a person could reasonably handle before lunch. Because I've known your family longer than you think, he said finally. And because watching you get treated like collateral for a failing construction company makes me want to burn down considerably more than one dinner party. That's oddly specific, I said. Also weirdly romantic, in a deeply concerning way. I contain multitudes, he said, and handed me another coffee, which I decided on balance was an entirely acceptable answer for now. Julian called 11 times over the following week, which I answered exactly once, purely to establish tone. Nora, we need to talk, he said, his voice carrying the particular strain of a man who could feel a spreadsheet-shaped disaster approaching but couldn't quite locate its source. You've been distant, cold. It's not like you.
Funny, I said.
I've never felt more like myself in my entire life. Almost like getting nearly killed clarifies priorities. What does that mean? It means I've discovered a delightful new hobby, I said. Reading financial disclosures. Have you ever read your family's cash flow statements, Julian? Riveting stuff. Practically a thriller. Silence stretched on the line, long enough that I could hear him recalculating, badly in real time. I don't know what you think you know, he said finally, but I promise you whatever it is, there's context. Oh, I love context, I said. Please give me some. I'm dying to hear how my fiance nearly died in a car accident engineered by the woman you've been quietly falling for fits into a broader, more forgivable context. The silence that followed had a very specific quality, the sound of a man's entire understanding of his own life quietly rearranging itself. Engineered, he repeated slowly. What are you talking about? Paige paid a man to frighten me outside your mother's gala, I said, keeping my voice pleasant, almost conversational, the way you discuss weather or mildly disappointing restaurant service. He got overzealous. I ended up in a coma for 3 weeks. But sure, let's talk about context. That's not, Nora. That can't be true. Paige wouldn't. Paige did, and has the wire transfers to prove it, I said. 3 payments. Very generous, actually, for attempted manslaughter. I'd expect a discount for volume, but I suppose ethics aren't her strong suit. Julian made a sound I'd never heard him make before, something between a laugh and a sob that clearly hadn't decided which emotion it belonged to yet. I need to see the evidence, he said. You'll see it, I said. At the contract renewal meeting, in front of your mother, my father, and everyone whose approval you've apparently valued more than mine for the last 6 months. I thought a room full of witnesses might help the information stick this time. Nora, please, we can handle this privately, quietly, without. Julian, I said, cutting him off with a particular gentleness reserved for delivering very bad news kindly. You've had 6 months of private and quiet. I gave you private and quiet. I'm done being private and quiet. I'm going public and extremely loud, with visual aids. I hung up before he could respond, set my phone face down on the counter, and found Gideon watching me from the kitchen doorway with an expression that looked suspiciously like admiration. Visual aids, he repeated. You've been planning a presentation. I've been planning a thorough presentation, I said. There will be charts, Gideon. Beautiful, damning charts. I haven't been this excited about a PowerPoint since business school. I'd like to see it, he said. You will, I said. Front row seat. I've already reserved it for you, right next to the seat where Julian Beckett is about to lose her mind in front of everyone whose respect she's spent 30 years cultivating. Gideon's mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile, but was clearly related to one. You're terrifying. Thank you, I said. I've been working on it. The contract renewal meeting took place in the Beckett family's boardroom, a room designed specifically to remind everyone entering it that money had once lived there generously, even if it currently visited only on scheduled occasions. My father sat at the head of the table, flanked by Callahan Manufacturing's legal team. Diane sat opposite him, radiating the particular calm of a woman who believed her son's engagement had already secured her company's survival. Julian sat beside her, pale and fidgeting, having spent the last week apparently unable to decide whether to believe me or simply hide from the entire situation. Paige had not been invited. I'd made sure of that personally, through a carefully worded note to Diane's assistant expressing my hope that recent friends of the family might be excluded from formal business matters, a request Diane had approved without apparently realizing whose friendship she was excluding. I walked in wearing the kind of blazer that suggested I meant business, with Gideon a careful, deliberate step behind me, close enough to be support, far enough not to overshadow the moment that was unmistakably mine. Nora, Diane said, rising with practiced warmth. So glad you're well enough to join us. Shall we begin discussing the renewal terms? Absolutely, I said, taking a seat and opening my laptop with the calm efficiency of a woman who had rehearsed this exact moment in the shower at least 4 times. Though I think we should start with a small addendum before the terms themselves. An addendum? A brief presentation, I said, connecting my laptop to the boardroom screen. Just a few slides. Shouldn't take more than 10 minutes. The first slide appeared, a timeline of the gala, the parking structure footage, timestamped and labeled with clinical precision. This is Beckett Holdings' most recent charity gala, I said pleasantly. And this is me, leaving early, upset, after witnessing something I'm sure everyone in this room already knows about, given how little anyone bothered hiding it. Diane's smile tightened. Julian stared at the table like it might swallow him whole, mercifully. This is the parking structure, I continued, advancing to the next slide, the grainy footage playing on loop. And this is the man who followed me, cornered me, and pushed me into the path of an oncoming vehicle, resulting in a 3-week coma, several broken ribs, and considerably less patience than I used to have for people who lie to me pleasantly. Nora, I don't see what this has to do with, Diane started. I'm getting there, I said, advancing again. This is the financial trail connecting 3 separate wire transfers to that man's account in the 2 weeks preceding the gala. And this, I said, letting the final slide land with the weight it deserved, is the sender's name. Paige Whitmore's name filled the screen, alongside dates, amounts, and account numbers clean enough to satisfy a courtroom. The boardroom went very, very quiet. She paid someone to frighten me, I said, closing my laptop with a soft, deliberate click, so she could comfort my fiance over my emotional collapse. Instead, she nearly killed me. I thought everyone deciding the terms of my family's contract renewal deserved to know exactly what kind of family they'd be tying us to for the next decade. Diane's face had gone the particular shade of gray reserved for women watching 30 years of careful social architecture collapse in real time. I had no knowledge of this, she said finally, her voice thin. I believe you, I said. Mostly because I don't think you're clever enough to have planned it yourself. But I do think you knew Paige was circling your son, and I do think you decided that was more useful to your company's survival than my actual well-being. That's its own kind of guilty, even if it's not the criminal kind. Julian finally looked up, his expression somewhere between devastated and relieved, the particular look of a man who'd just been handed permission to stop pretending. "Nora," he said quietly. "I'm so sorry."
"I know," I said.
Unfortunately, sorry doesn't renegotiate a contract. The contract renewal, unsurprisingly, did not proceed as originally planned. My father, who had sat silently through the entire presentation with the particular stillness of a man doing complicated math in his head, finally spoke once the room's shock had settled into something more manageable. "Callahan Manufacturing withdraws the preferential renewal terms," he said, closing his own folder with quiet, final authority. "We'll honor the current contract through its natural expiration, 6 months from now, and not a day beyond it. Beckett Holdings can seek partnership elsewhere." Diane's composure, already cracked, shattered entirely. "That contract is the only thing keeping this company afloat. You know that." "I do," my father said, unmoved. "I also know my daughter nearly died because your company's survival mattered more to the people in this room than her safety. I find those two facts difficult to reconcile into continued partnership." Diane turned to Julian, something desperate entering her voice. "Say something. Fix this." Julian looked at his mother for a long moment, and something in his expression finally, fully hardened into a decision he'd clearly been avoiding for months. "I can't fix 6 months of choosing to ignore what was happening in front of me," he said quietly. "I don't think I should try to fix it with a spreadsheet, Mother. I think I should have fixed it by actually paying attention to my fiance instead of Paige." "Julian." "I'm not marrying Paige," he said, cutting her off. "I'm not marrying anyone right now. I need to figure out how I became a man who let this happen before I promise myself to anyone else." It wasn't the apology I'd spent 6 months wanting. It was, unexpectedly, better, an honest reckoning instead of a performance, delivered without an audience's approval as its goal. I stood, gathering my laptop, and looked at Diane one last time. "For what it's worth, I don't think you're evil. I think you're frightened and desperate and willing to look away from things that were inconvenient to see clearly. I understand that impulse. I simply won't be the collateral for it anymore." I walked out of that boardroom with Gideon beside me, my engagement formally, publicly, thoroughly over, and felt, for the first time in longer than I could accurately remember, entirely and completely unburdened. That, Gideon said, once we were in the elevator, was the single most satisfying PowerPoint presentation I have ever witnessed. "High praise," I said. "I do have a follow-up slide deck prepared for Paige's legal proceedings, if you're interested." "Obviously," he said. "I wouldn't miss it." I looked at him, this steady, quietly devoted man who'd spent 3 weeks sitting in hospital chairs and several more delivering coffee and financial spreadsheets with equal patience, and felt something warm and entirely unrelated to revenge settle into my chest. "Buy me dinner," I said. "Somewhere with actual chairs, not hospital ones. I think I've earned a meal that doesn't come with an 4 attached." "I know exactly the place," Gideon said, and for the first time since I'd woken up in that hospital room, I let myself look forward to something without any sarcasm attached to it at all. 6 months later, Paige Whitmore pled guilty to conspiracy charges in exchange for a reduced sentence. Her carefully cultivated reputation dismantled one wire transfer at a time by prosecutors who apparently found my color-coded folder considerably more useful than I'd expected. Julian Beckett stepped back from Beckett Holdings' day-to-day leadership shortly after the contract expired, the company eventually restructuring under new partners who had, notably, never once treated a fiancé like collateral. Julian, last I heard, had taken an unglamorous consulting job in another city, apparently determined to figure out who he was without a spreadsheet telling him who to marry. I didn't hate him anymore, which surprised me more than it probably should have. Mostly, I just felt distance, clean and uncomplicated, the particular relief of finally putting down something heavy I hadn't realized I was still carrying. Gideon proposed on an ordinary Tuesday, which I found, on reflection, entirely correct for a man who'd never once needed an audience to mean what he said. "No boardroom," I said, eyeing the small velvet box he'd produced over dinner, entirely without ceremony, in my own kitchen.
"No PowerPoint."
"I'm almost disappointed. I considered slides," he said. "I decided against it. Some presentations don't need visual aids." "Bold strategy," I said. "Continue." He opened the box. A simple ring, nothing showy. Exactly the kind of understated I'd come to expect from a man who apparently expressed devotion primarily through coffee deliveries and quietly devastating financial investigations. "I'm not asking because I saved you," he said, "or because I've apparently been quietly in love with you since long before either of us admitted it. I'm asking because you're the most terrifying, thorough, wildly sarcastic woman I've ever met, and I would like to spend considerably more time being on the receiving end of both your gratitude and your color-coded revenge folders." "That's oddly specific," I said, my voice considerably less steady than I intended. "I contain multitudes," he said, echoing himself with a small, deliberate smile.
"Fine," I said.
"But I want it on record that I'm agreeing entirely on my own terms, with zero financial pressure, zero family obligation, and zero PowerPoint presentations required." "Duly noted," he said, sliding the ring onto my finger with the same careful, patient attention he'd brought to every single moment since that hospital room. I looked at him, steady, quietly devoted, entirely unbothered by my worst instincts, and thought about the woman who'd woken up 3 weeks unconscious and immediately, instinctively reached for exactly the right hand in the room. Turns out my subconscious had better judgment than 6 months of consciously ignoring every red flag ever had. If you'd woken up from a coma into a mess like mine, would you have played along? Or burned it all down on day one? Tell me in the comments. And if you enjoyed this story, hit like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.